So the title for my lecture is Me and My Career, A Tale of Serendipity, Scandal and Satan. Serendipity is a recurring theme, as you'll find out. Scandal, as I'm sure most of you know, is self-explanatory. And Satan, some of you might know where Satan fits in, but if you don't, then I'm afraid you've got to wait right to the end to find out. So what is serendipity? The term serendipity was coined by Horace Walpole in 1754, and it was suggested by the three princes of Serendip, which was the title of a fairy tale where the three heroes were always making discoveries by accident of things they were not in quest of. Bit of family history. This is my dad on the left, me, my sister Anne, and my mum, and just on the right hand side you can see our dog Pooch. That's on the beach in Filey. My mum was a sister on the paediatric ward at Leeds General Infirmary, and it's difficult to believe, but back in the 1950s it was a rarity for parents to be allowed to visit their kids. But one of Mum's major achievement really was to allow evening visiting by the mothers in particular to settle their children for sleep. I'm sure there are a lot of parents who are very grateful to her for that. My father was an orthopaedic surgeon in the West Riding of Yorkshire and in Leeds. He published a number of papers in the BMJ and Lancet. These include a tracheotomy for flail chest. For those who don't know what a flail chest is, it's where the bones at the front of the chest are broken, usually from an accident, and obviously it impairs one's breathing. He wrote a paper on this, which is a supporting bar for Pearson's knee flexion piece. And this is the paper I think he was most proud of, which is a simple operation for the overlapping fifth toe. This is the paper I like, and this is one of Dad's inventions, which was the mechanical screwdriver for the nail plate operation, and this was published in the Lancet in 1954. And I have to say, I find it absolutely amazing where Dad's mechanical screwdriver for the nail plate operation turns up and what it ends up being used for. It's been adapted a bit, I think. I was born in Castleford, the same place where Henry Moore was born, and brought up in Leeds. My primary school was Furtree, and one thing I vividly recollect is when I was walking to school, I used to see a little boy sitting in a milk float helping the milkman with the deliveries. And it turns out it was this chap, Marco Pierre White. In fact, he and his brothers all went to Furtree. His brother Clive was in my year, and his other brother Graham was in my sister's year, but Marco was actually a bit young to be at the same school when I was there. After scraping through the 11 plus, I went to Roundhay Grammar School, which was one of the old state grammar schools. And the only really famous old Roundhegian to go there was this chap. This is Arthur Brown, a.k.a. The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. And before I move on, I'd just like you to hear a few words from him.
I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you fire. I'll take you to burn. Fire. I'll take you to learn.
Anyway, that's Arthur. On the 6th of October 1975, a youth from Sheffield, namely Robert Hammond, and I walked into Sheffield Medical School together for our very first day. I have to say it's been a pleasure and a privilege to come here to work in Nottingham and to sometimes work alongside Robert. My two major influences when I was at Sheffield were firstly the Western Park Hospital, where there was superb teaching on oncology, and the other major influence was Dr. James Underwood, who was the senior lecturer in pathology, and he's now Professor Sir James Underwood. I found his teaching inspiring, and throughout my career he has given me a terrific amount of support in many different ways. As an insurance policy, before I did my degree, I took the MRCS LRCP exam, which is also known as the conjoint exam. After the obstetrics and gynae exam, I was walking past the London Palladium, and I was surrounded by a mass of photographers, and I hadn't a clue what was going on until this chap got out of a Rolls Royce. So the following day I rang my mum and dad, and you never guess who I saw in London, and said, yeah, we know we saw your photograph in the Telegraph. My first newspaper appearance. So this is me and Dad when I got my degree at Sheffield. Note the beard and the suit. Despite being a Sheffield student, I managed to get a house job in Leicester working for Professor Peter Bell, now Professor Sir Peter Bell. I clearly remember making a phone call to the outgoing house officer to find out what the job was like, and I always remember the name. It was Nigel Sparrow, and in fact Nigel Sparrow was the past president of the Med Chi, so that was quite a coincidence. The other thing which was important about Professor Bell's house job is that he had a registrar called Henry Pearson. Henry Pearson always used to wander around the ward with a sachet of intralipid in his hand, which I always found rather amusing. As an SHO in Leicester, I rotated through histopathology and also through hematology, clinical chemistry and microbiology. I found it extremely beneficial, particularly for research, being able to sample the different areas of pathology and see different techniques that could be used. This is a photograph of the staff there. My wife Lorraine is third in from the top. You can see me, and then next to me is Paul Shaw, who is the Chief Executive of Empath, and our lab manager, Pete Dewby, just near me. Now, strange how things go around full circle. Nottingham Pathology is also part of Empath, which incorporates Leicester Pathology as well. So people ask me, how does pathology compare to other jobs in medicine? Well, the simple answer is psychiatrists know nothing and do nothing. Physicians know everything and do nothing. Surgeons know nothing and do everything. And pathologists know everything and do everything 24 hours too late. all in the timing. So histopathology is the study of gross pathology and also microscopic pathology. And I have an example for you of gross pathology. I wonder if anyone can tell me what it is. No, Steph, come on. It's a room with a view. Anyway, on to more serious things. I told you about Professor Bell's registrar, Henry Pearson, messing around with the intralipid. And by chance, I was in the haematology lab in Leicester, and Henry Pearson wandered by and asked if I'd be interested in joining his research project. And these two test tubes really demonstrate what the research was about. If you add a drop of intralipid to serum from a healthy patient, and you mix it up and just leave it or incubate it, it just stays as a uniform emulsion, and that's the white test tube on the left. If you mix it with serum from someone who's acutely ill, for example, someone with pneumonia, someone who's been in a road traffic accident, someone who's had a heart attack, then the serum doesn't stay in this uniform emulsion. What happens is that the particles of intralipid clump together, float to the surface, forming a layer of cream, or what that looks like cream, and beneath it is clear serum. And this phenomenon is called creaming. And this is what it looks like down the microscope. So this is intralipid mixed with normal healthy serum. It's actually quite striking looking at it down the microscope. You can't really appreciate it when it's still, but when you're looking at a drop of intralipid in serum down the microscope, you see these tiny little particles moving in Brownian motion. So they're all sort of jiggling about. These particles are about 0.1 microns across, and to put that in perspective, a red blood cell is about 7 microns across. So they're very, very tiny. Now, the intralipid, when it's mixed with serum from an acutely ill patient, this is what happens. The tiny little particles clump together, and these clumps are up to 200 microns across, so they're very, very, really quite big. In fact, they're so big that you can see them with the naked eye. And this is what it looks like at a higher power. A couple of years earlier, before we started our research on creaming and intralipid, Malcolm Levine and Wigglesworth from the Hammersmith wrote a paper in The Lancet in 1980 describing pulmonary fat accumulation in preterm infants following intralipid infusion. And they warned that these intralipid emboli may exacerbate ventilation perfusion inequality, so they could actually be harmful to the babies. So the question is, well, first of all, are these emboli? For those who don't understand what an embolus is, it's where there's something big enough in the bloodstream to block a blood vessel further downstream. So the theory is that the thing that causes these emboli to occur is the same factor that causes intralipid to agglutinate and cream in serum from acutely ill patients. There are a number of clues as to what the creaming factor is. So, as I've said, it's present in sera of acutely ill patients, and it's either not present in sera from healthy individuals or present at very, very low levels. The phenomenon is also known to be calcium dependent because you can inhibit it by adding EDTA or citrate. And there's an American called Levine, a different Levine, who did some work on an intravenous fat emulsion based on cottonseed oil called lipumol, and he speculated that it was a gamma globulin that causes this to happen. So we decided to try to find out what this creaming factor is. So what we did was serum electrophoresis. The sera had been divided into two groups. We'd done creaming tests on all of them, so we knew which sera creamed intralipid and which didn't. You see just below the top of those blue strips, you can see a faint white line. That's the origin. You put a drop of serum there, then you pass an electric current through the gel, and the proteins separate. The thick band that you see at the bottom is albumin, and the band at the far end is the gamma globulin band. In the middle, you can see there's a thick band in the gamma globulin region, and that's a paraprotein. That's the sort of pattern you might see in someone with myeloma. The second to bottom band is alpha-1 antitrypsin. Now, if this chap Levine was correct, then we'd expect to see a change in the gamma globulin area, but there was no significant change there. The creaming serum is number 4057, second in from the left, and by comparison, the normal serum is number 6362. So what you see is that the albumin looks a bit low. The alpha-1 antitrypsin and the alpha-2 band above that look a bit high. But I hadn't a clue what this meant until I bumped into this chap just out in Leicester in the labs. This is Professor Herb Sewell, who's professor here in Nottingham. And I happened to have one of these electrophoresis gels with me, and I showed it to him and asked him what he made of it. And he said that the creams were showing the acute phase pattern. So that gave me a clue. So the next thing to do was to go to Index Medicus, this was pre-computer days, and look up for any likely candidates, any acute phase proteins that would fit the bill. And in fact, I stumbled across a paper describing agglutination of lipid suspensions by C-reactive protein. So, and reading more about C-reactive protein, that seemed to fit the bill perfectly. So we then did some further tests measuring the CRP, which I'll come on to in a moment. And just very, very briefly tell you about C-reactive protein. This is the classic acute phase protein. It was discovered by Tillett and Francis in 1930. They were looking at serological reactions to fractions from the pneumococcus extract. The pneumococcus is the bug that causes lobar pneumonia. And they found that there was a protein that precipitated fraction C of the new polysaccharide capsule. And they called it the C-reactive substance. And it's got a pentamer structure very much like this. We know other things about C-reactive protein. It has a calcium-dependent phosphorylcholine binding site. It is present in very low levels in the healthy and rapidly goes to very high levels in acutely ill within hours. So it's a very good test for acute illness. And it binds damaged cell membranes, bacterial, fungal and parasite remnants. And it is effectively an early defense mechanism. So very, very briefly, run some tests on 100 random sera, and the most striking and most significant result was right at the bottom, the average C-reactive protein of a non-creamer was 1.5 milligrams per deciliter, and the cream was 10.7. So creamers had significantly raised CRPs. I was fortunate in being able to get some purified CRP from Professor Mark Pepys at the Hammersmith Hospital. Purified CRP actually doesn't agglutinate intralipid, but if you add a drop of calcium or a drop of magnesium, then it agglutinates it within moments. So we wrote a paper and had it published in The Lancet within a year of starting the project. Serendipity, again, there was a new paediatric senior lecturer appointed at Leicester Royal Infirmary, and this was a chap called Malcolm Levine. He was one of the authors of the paper. He was the author of the intralipid embolism in neonates that was published in The Lancet in 1980. So we immediately started a prospective study, and there happened to be a premature neonate that was receiving intralipid. There was some serum was available, and the serum creamed intralipid, and the CRP was raised. Unfortunately, the baby died from cardiac failure due to a large VSD completely unrelated to intralipid. And at post-mortem, this is what we found. The black bubbly area at the top is an intralipid embolus, and just by comparison, this is what, at the bottom of the picture, you can see what intralipid looks like when it's agglutinated in vitro. So it seemed to me pretty convincing that C-reactive protein was the culprit causing intralipid agglutination and also intralipid embolism. So the question then was, if C-reactive protein can agglutinate intralipid, can it cause chylomicrons to clump together? So I went to the canteen and had the fattiest meal I could find, and after a couple of hours had myself bled and harvested some chylomicrons, and then added my chylomicrons to some sera from an acutely ill patient, and this is what happened. They agglutinated. So exactly the same phenomenon happens with chylomicrons as it does with intralipid, and indeed very low density lipoproteins also are agglutinated by sera of acutely ill patients, and it's all to do with high levels of CRP. So the interesting question is what happens in life acutely ill patients almost certainly agglutinate their chylomicrons, and conditions such as osteonecrosis have been, some people have suggested that non-traumatic fat embolism can cause osteonecrosis, and this is one mechanism whereby it could theoretically happen. But the other intriguing question is, if C-reactive protein we know binds to damaged cell membranes, so C-reactive protein could conceivably bind to the damaged cell membranes lining the aorta, for example, and this gives, to me, is a very plausible way that C-reactive protein can be integral in building up an atheromatous plaque, because if CRP binds to the damaged cell membrane, then chylomicrons of VLDL floating by will then attach to the CRP, etc., and then you get a fatty deposit building up. And indeed, C-reactive protein has been demonstrated using immunohistochemistry in atheromatous plaques. Anyway, enough of that. I moved on to London in 1984, working at St George's, St James's in Balham, St Helier and the Royal Marsden, and the chap I was appointed with was Dick Shepherd, who was he was appointed as a senior registrar as well, and Dick Shepherd is the forensic pathologist who's going to come and speak to us in November. While at St George's, I'll just briefly show you this. This is an example of amoebic colitis. In the gut, you may find amoebae that do no harm, and those amoebae don't ingest red blood cells, but amoebae that cause amoebic colitis, they do ingest red blood cells. So Lorraine and I invented this stain, which is called the PAS Martius yellow, because it shows that these are amoebae on the left, and the yellow dots are red blood cells. This is quite a useful stain for demonstrating amoebic colitis. My first consultant post was at Kingsmill, working with Finton Dowling and Pippa Stocks. There's Finton on the right. And while I was at Kingsmill, I decided to cobble together my research into an MD. My advisor was Professor Underwood, and he suggested for the final chapter I should look at the instance of fat embolism in non-selected autopsies. So I had 100 non-selected, predominantly coroner's autopsies. This was with the agreement of the coroner. And I found that overall 43% of patients had fat emboli. Other studies found an instance between 31 and 74%. So if you look for it, it's actually very common. And in patients with no history of trauma, 23% had fat emboli. And other studies published results from between 8 and 66%. Again, surprisingly common. I turned my attention to looking at the frequency of precancerous changes in the cervix following large loop excisions of the cervix as a form of treatment. And this was published in the J-Clin Path. And Professor Jack Kuzik, who was at the Cancer Research, what's now Cancer Research UK, spotted the paper, and Kingsmill was invited to be the fifth centre in their very significant study looking at HPV screening in testing in cervical screening, and this was the heart study. And that was finally published in The Lancet in 2002. At the turn of the century, as the 90s became the noughties, Alder Hay and Bristol happened with the human tissue retention becoming a national obsession, and Dr. bashing became indiscriminate and rather vindictive. I remember it as if it was yesterday, 11:10 on Friday night, the 2nd of June. I just got back from Euro Disney. One thing which always amused me about Disney is that Nathan, my youngest, he said that one of the rides was so scary that he nearly swallowed his throat. Which takes some doing. Anyway, we returned from Euro Disney, and there was a note from the people from our old house. We just moved a year earlier. And they said there was some reporters staking out the house and desperate for a photograph of me. And I had no clue as to what was going on. I thought, well, it might be a good news story. I've been looking after Kingsmill histopathology single-handedly for a few months, so maybe it was to do with that, but sadly it wasn't. They said they were from the Nursing Times, but eventually they let it be known that they were actually from the News of the World. So I had a very restless night, slept for about 2 hours, and then I got a phone call to go to the Trust HQ at Kingsmill. The chief executive told me that the mortuary workers had made some allegations against me about disposal of baby organs, and Alan Milburn, who was the Secretary of State for Health, had taken a personal interest in the case, and he made a number of demands. The first one was that I be immediately suspended. The second was that the mortuary workers should be protected as whistleblowers, and the third demand was that an external inquiry be set up. Saturday night, everything was quiet. There's no mention, not a sniff of it in the news. I thought, well, maybe it'll blow over. Because I really was mystified as to what the allegations were. I slept for about 1.5 hours, and for the first time in my life I experienced a cold sweat. And turned the TV on at 6 in the morning, and to my horror, the very first thing on the national news was the Kingsmill baby organs scandal. Pretty unpleasant watching it, and I couldn't resist watching Frost on Sunday, which I should have done, I suppose. But anyway, Alan Milburn was the guest on Frost on Sunday, and I remember David Frost virtually spitting out the words, asking him about the disturbing scandal at Kingsmill. And Alan Milburn told him that, of course, he'd ordered a full investigation. Throughout the morning, I received numerous phone calls from relatives, family, and friends offering places of refuge and support. One of the reporters came to the door, and I explained to him that I'd been advised that I couldn't make any comment about the allegations. But off the cuff, just as he was walking away, I said to him, "Oh, I can't believe it's blown up like this." This is the News of the World from the 4th of June 2000. The front page story is the Queen meets Camilla, and this was really when the first time the Queen officially accepted and met Camilla in public, which paved the way for Camilla and Prince Charles to get married. You'll of course see on the bottom it says, "Hospital dumps baby organs." Yeah, you can have a peek of the inside. This is the story on the inside of the News of the World, and I remember made my father-in-law cry. In many ways I found the whole stories that unfolded very humbling because of the most wonderful support and love that I received from my family, friends, colleagues. Monday morning, the 5th of June, one thing that I still clearly remember is, again, watching the news, and there's a reporter standing outside number 10 talking about the NHS summit that they were going to hold that day, and then, of course, he added, "And, of course, the Prime Minister will be briefed on the latest baby organ scandal." So I found it rather bizarre, thinking that I was going to be discussed with the Prime Minister. This is the front cover of the Sun on the 5th of June. One thing I omitted to say was that on the Saturday, when we needed to go out and do some shopping, having got back from Euro Disney, and so I decided to go to Sainsbury's, and I opened the front door and was met by a volley of clicks and flashes from photographers. Anyway, this is the front page of the Sun, and just a little flick through the Sun. You can see on the right-hand page, the second story down on the left is what, in my opinion, is the most tragic story in the Sun, which was about a man who was going for a stroll and was knifed to death. Slightly more prominent than that is another very tragic story about a hero who drowns trying to save an 11-year-old girl who was swimming. But now let's turn, this is on page 15, let's turn to page 9. This is me, the doctor who chucked out baby's organs with the trash. I mean, this was a photograph taken of me just as I was about to go to Sainsbury's. My first reaction was to shield my eyes, but then I thought if I do that, I'll just look guilty as hell, so I just let the photographers take a photograph of me. So just look at the picture and note the poacher-style jacket with a corduroy collar, casual shirts and casual trousers. On the Thursday, my friend Ray, who's over there, rang me up absolutely furious because he'd read section G2 of The Guardian, where there was an article by a journalist called Shane Watson called "There's Nothing More Divisive Than Chinos." So to set the scene, can I just draw your attention to the picture at the bottom, which is Harry Enfield's characters, the Slobs. And now I'll read you the first paragraph of the story. It said, "This week, on the same day that the papers carried the story that Tony Blair considered the conventional men's suit to be one of the tyrannies of modern life, the same papers carried a picture of one of the doctors embroiled in the baby's organ scandal. Call me old-fashioned, but as he stood there in his corduroy-collared poacher-style jacket, denim effect shirt and casual trousers, I saw someone ill-equipped to deal with the difficult times ahead. I saw someone whose appearance suggested he was not as meticulous, disciplined, and upright as he might be. I saw someone in desperate need of a suit." I did seriously consider just wearing a jacket today because I actually object to wearing a suit because of what she said, but anyway, it's my presidential address, so I thought I'd wear a suit. Following Sunday, this article was published in the News of the World, and in my opinion, this is the story where the News of the World shot itself in the foot. It sent a clear message to people that the stories they had published in the previous week and this week were malicious and driven by a grievance against the trust. This is one of the letters in the News of the World. I'll read it to you. "The practices carried out at Kingsmill Hospital make Baron Frankenstein's work look civilised. Let's hope it's not the tip of the iceberg, with many other hospitals carrying out similar procedures." Well, I bet what J. Stanley of Liverpool didn't realise is that there is actually a tenuous link between Frankenstein and Kingsmill. Honestly, there is. The author Mary Shelley was on holiday on the shores of Lake Geneva with Lord Byron, amongst others. And Lord Byron suggested that they have a competition to see who could write the best horror story. And of course, we all know that Mary Shelley wrote the best horror story, which was Frankenstein. Byron, of course, comes from Newstead, and if Kingsmill had existed, then Kingsmill would have been Byron's local hospital, and if it wasn't for Byron, Frankenstein wouldn't have existed. Wednesday, the 21st of June 2008, there were preliminary reports on the TV that the findings of the external inquiry will give the Kingsmill Hospital the all clear. Despite that, I had to remain suspended. On Thursday, the 29th of June, there was a consultant extraordinary meeting at Kingsmill. My reinstatement was demanded, and I have to say that I cannot be more grateful to the consultants at Kingsmill. I couldn't have wished for better colleagues. And after 6 weeks suspension, I did return to work, but that was only after the threat of a vote of no confidence in the Trust Board chairman. I think what the government wanted was for me to remain suspended until the external inquiry was quietly slipped out, which was, it was published on the 12th of September. It was found that Kingsmill was vindicated and the allegations were found to be false. The publication of the story in the News of the World on the 4th of June was due to frustrations from Andy May, one of the mortuary workers, arising from an unresolved grievance. Here you can see me wearing a smart jacket and tie. I've been exonerated, and this was an interview with hospital doctor. The penultimate chapter in this sorry tale was the tribunal, and the 3 mortuary workers have been sacked and they failed to get their jobs back. The finale was fairly recently. This is the last ever edition of the News of the World, but of course, if you have a look through, here you can see the front page. Queen meets. They've published a lot of the front pages of what they considered to be their key stories, and of course the Queen meeting Camilla was one, but of course you can't fail to notice that at the bottom it says is the article about hospital dumping babies' organs. The one thing that I often think about with this dreadful episode was bad enough suspending me and awful for my family, but the people who really suffered were the bereaved, those who'd had their wounds of loss opened wide by these allegations. And in fact there was a helpline at Kingsmill for weeks for upset relatives. But the other thing that I think was a major casualty, in fact definitely was a major casualty, not of Kingsmill but as a fallout of Alderhay and Bristol, is research. To me there's no argument that practices around tissue retention and disposal needed to be tightened up. In my view, it's too tight. So much so that it's destroyed the spontaneity of discovery of research. This research we did on intralipid, all these sera were sera that I'd collected from clinical chemistry. They were about to be discarded. And by running a series of tests on these sera, we published what I consider to be a useful addition to medical knowledge. It probably explains why babies get these intralipid emboli, and I think could theoretically save lives. Today, with the Human Tissue Act, it would be impossible to do spontaneous research like that. The other thing that we couldn't do is to look at the incidence of fat embolism in unselected postmortems. Now, I feel that medical research is very much like solving a big jigsaw puzzle. If you're fortunate, you'll find some pieces to slip in that fit. But I do worry that some of the pieces for this big jigsaw are missing and may never be found. A very difficult decision I made was to leave Kingsmill. A job came up at Nottingham City which I felt was too good to miss. My interest changed more from research to teaching. I felt that using video podcasts was a fantastic way of recording and sharing MedChi lectures, and also it's a fantastic tool for helping teach medical students. The advantage of podcasts is that you can have short bursts of teaching using audio and video, and it's a good way of, you can use all sorts of different techniques to drive a point home. So I'll just show you a very, very tiny clip of rheumatic mitral valve disease, and the deformity you get in the mitral valve, someone who's had rheumatic fever, is that the leaflets of the valve confuse together, producing what's called a fish mouth deformity, where it looks like a fish mouth.
This is the typical fish mouth type appearance of mitral stenosis due to rheumatic heart disease.
So finally, I shall just introduce you to my family. This is my wife Lorraine, and I can't thank and praise her enough for all the support she's given me through the good times and the bad. My son Joshua, who is a second-year GEM student in Nottingham and Derby, following in his father and grandfather's footsteps. This is my youngest son Nathan, who is now doing product design at Nottingham Trent. Again, I think he's inherited his flair for design from both his grandfathers. His maternal grandfather was a very gifted craftsman. And this is my daughter Jennifer. She is actually in a trailer when she was filming an episode for Peaky Blinders, which the series starts on tomorrow, in fact. And she appears in a scene. And one of the stars of Peaky Blinders is an actor called Sam Neill. And the coincidence is that Sam Neill appeared when I did my last bit of paid work before I started my health jobs in Leicester. I got paid £20 and 2 chicken dinners appearing as an extra in a film which Sam Neill was starring in called The Final Conflict. In my view, it's the best of the Omen trilogy films. With many films, there's the director's cut. You know, the film comes out, and then a little while later, the director's cut comes out. But I want to present to you the extras cut. I hope you enjoy it.
Disciples of the Watch, I stand before you in the name of the one true God, who is cast out from heaven, but is alive in me. Do you hear me? I now command you to seek out and destroy the Nazarene child, Baal, and I perish. Slay the Nazarene, and you, my disciples, do you hear me? Disciples of the Watch, there must be no delay. Slay the Nazarene, and the victory will be ours. Now and forevermore. Do you hear me? We hear, 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 we hear.
Thanks very much.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for that amazing talk. I was slightly surprised to see your first and past encounter with Satan was at Roundhay. And when you graduated from Sheffield Medical School, at least I thought you were a part surgeon when you put up MRCS, but then I discovered it wasn't really. At least you had a decent beard then. I'll certainly be carrying around a sachet of Intralipid when I do trauma calls now, avoiding hamburgers when I'm sick. I was horrified to hear about your terrible time in 2000. I'm very pleased to hear that you were supported appropriately by your colleagues at Kingsmill. Many congratulations for them to doing it. I now know not to buy pheasant in Mansfield. And I'm glad to know you still object to wearing a suit much as I do. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I've looked at the programme before you put it up, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of them. Thank you again.
Thank you. Just before we wind up, there is even more cheese and wine outside, and coffee, soft drinks. So I hope you'll join us for a chat. The next meeting is on the 12th of November with Professor Dick Shepherd. I'd like to wish my Muslim colleagues on Saturday Eid Mubarak, my Jewish colleagues Shana Tova. Thank you.